Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, our Executive Director, Chris Costa, is joined by Rebecca Ulam Weiner, Assistant Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism at the New York City Police Department, the NYPD. Rebecca oversees investigative, analytical, operational, and engagement efforts across the domains of counterterrorism, counterintelligence, criminal intelligence, violence mitigation, infrastructure and event protection, cyber threat intelligence, and geopolitical risk for the NYPD. She develops policy and strategic priorities for the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau and publicly represents the NYPD in matters involving counterterrorism and intelligence. Her deep background includes serving as the first representative of local law enforcement on the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, National Intelligence Council, and serving as legal counsel for the Intelligence Bureau's Intelligence Analysis Unit and as team leader for the Middle East and North Africa, overseeing intelligence collection and analysis related to threats associated with those regions. So this is incredibly diverse and rich background, which we are so thrilled she will be drawing on for us today. If you've been with us before, you know that after Chris and Rebecca discuss the issues that are catching their attention, we'll turn to your questions. Please use the Q&A feature to write them in. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible, but as you know, we kind of get flooded and we may not get to all of them. So we appreciate your patience with that. Before I turn it over to Chris, we have to thank our very generous sponsor, Zach Schwitzky and Limbic, for sponsoring today's Spy Chat with Rebecca and Chris. We really appreciate your support. Now, over to you, Chris. Thanks so much.
Amanda, as always, thanks for the great introduction. And I also want to thank Limbic and our CEO friend, Zach. We're very grateful for the sponsorship. I also want to write up front a bit of a preface. I want to note that I've spent a lot of time in the early 2000s working with NYPD detectives as part of the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. And I became familiar with the Intelligence Bureau's work, which is a story that is not widely known outside of New York City, other than national security circles. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity to share some of Rebecca's perspectives that she's willing to share and provide some insights. In fact, Rebecca and I recently reconnected in Doha, Qatar, where we spoke at the Global Security Forum, where she wowed the audience on her deep knowledge of artificial intelligence. And we also both spoke on related issues in Las Vegas at a counterterrorism conference. In fact, again, Rebecca clearly wowed the audience on artificial intelligence, which is certainly in the news. So with that as a preface, I'm going to dive right in. And the first story that I'm going to talk about is a continuation from last week, because I did not have a chance to really dig in to the White House national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. Of course, that was breaking news last Spy Chat. We had Josh Geltzer from the White House. He had just finished as part of the press conference when POTUS, President Biden, talked about the new strategy. I have since had a chance to look at it, to analyze it. And the bottom line is, I think it is an excellent effort. The United States government is trying to focus not just a whole of government effort, but really a whole of society effort on ensuring United States communities, campuses understand the depth of the anti-Semitic threats that continues across this country. The spread of hate speech, social media, companies, their involvement to help counter those kinds of threats. So we're going to talk about that today, but I just want to underscore the point that that is an important national security strategy, and I want to make sure that I provide some commentary on it since I've had the opportunity to look at it. In the next story is really related to that, because New York City certainly has a large population of Jewish Americans and Israelis that are in New York City. And this story really gets to the heart of that and puts a finer point on the idea of anti-Semitism and attacks on innocent people in New York City in particular. An individual by the name of Saddam Massoud was found guilty and is spending 18 months in prison for attacking 3 different individuals at 3 separate events because, frankly, they were Jewish. And it's a story that plays out across the country. And of course, there's an ongoing trial as a result of the attack, the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. So we want to keep talking about these kinds of threats. And there's a global trend that's suggesting that anti-Semitism globally is on the rise as well. The next story is a very NYPD-centric story, and this goes back to my respect for the Intelligence Bureau, and it has to do with the 2003 program, the International Liaison Program, where NYPD sends experienced detectives to some countries overseas. That may surprise some of our audience. It was a post 9/11 initiative to ensure that NYPD had a forward presence. In other words, NYPD, my characterization, is not going to be surprised again. And they're not going to exclusively rely on the US government vis-a-vis the FBI, CIA, and the rest of the US intelligence community to defend New York. That program has existed since 2003. I think it's an inspired program, and I think Rebecca will have some insights as to where that program is. In short, it's sending detectives abroad to follow initially terrorism leads, but I think it's been broadened because you have a detective that's overseas that can follow also other criminal leads, but I think it's a solid program. And from my count, and Rebecca can correct me, there's some 16 of these outstations, if you will, my characterization. The next story that got my attention last month was a tweet about a Pentagon explosion. And the reason I bring this up is because that tweet was a fake and it was quickly debunked, but it was in part artificial intelligence is part of the challenge here, because it may have played a role in spreading this false story. And again, because Rebecca is so steeped in artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence has this duality of being a good thing and a bad thing, I want to ensure that I underscore the importance of these kinds of stories, because artificial intelligence is going to propagate deep fakes. It already has in the past, and this is another example that you may have saw that was quickly debunked a couple of weeks ago when a tweet went out that said the Pentagon was attacked. And it was local authorities that quickly said that that was inaccurate and the Pentagon was not attacked. All right, the next story, I'm switching gears a little bit, is something we have talked about in past spy chats. I think it's an important story, and it's this idea of the Chinese program called Fox Hunt. What am I talking about? You might remember that China is using their police officers, if you will, and other agents of China to go after dissidents worldwide. What's important to note is this is an extrajudicial effort to take individuals that are maybe outspoken on China policies, dissidents, identify them, in some cases, try to get them back into mainland China, where they'll be punished by the communist Chinese government. What's interesting about the particular case that I'm referring to is a trial. I believe it's the first one, just started in New York City, in a former NYPD detective sergeant is one of the defendants. Innocent until proven guilty, but he reportedly was involved in again, from the news reporting, harassing and putting pressure on these dissidents in New Jersey at the behest of the Chinese government. Of course, the defense is suggesting that he was completely unwitting. We'll let this case play out, but it really reinforces this notion of the global threat of China going after dissidents worldwide. We've seen the idea of police stations in anywhere from Belgium to New York City that are undeclared. In many cases, the FBI has jurisdiction in the United States, but that's an important case that tracks with some of our past discussions, to include discussions I've had with the director of the FBI on Fox Hunt. The next story does get my attention. It should get everybody's attention that's listening to Spy Chat today. And the headline was, Afghanistan has become a terrorism staging ground again, leak reviews or reveals. I don't like talking about Discord leaks, but this is a constant cacophonous message of the Taliban is not doing their due diligence. We shouldn't be surprised, in my humble opinion, but at the end of the day, the Taliban is not focused on over 20 terrorist organizations that are operating in the Afghan space. The Taliban are not good partners for counterterrorism. That is the gist of the reporting. And of course, remember that 9/11, New York, Manhattan suffered the attack, as well as the Pentagon, as well as the hijacking that ended in a field in Pennsylvania. All of that said, this ties back to, a threat that could emanate from a place like Afghanistan again. And a UN report just underscored everything that I just said. That is open for the public to read about concerns from the United Nations on that particular threat. And I believe Peter Bergen, a friend of spy museums and an excellent reporter, wrote an article on CNN in the past week also expressing his concern. All right, wrapping up. Oh boy, I almost forgot my favorite story. And this is another NYPD story, and I hope I get it right. The gist of the story is an individual by the name of Abdullah El-Faisal was a radical cleric. Similar to al-Awlaki, he inspired many terrorists. In fact, number 2 on the hit list. Many of these former jihadists have said, hey, I was inspired by al-Awlaki. Many were inspired also by Faisal. Faisal was an individual that served some time for radicalizing and violating laws in the UK, the United Kingdom. He served his time, ended up back in Jamaica, where he had a bunch of websites where he tried to radicalize youth. And here's the interesting part of the case. He violated New York state laws, not federal laws, that were put in place post 9/11. NYPD had some undercover officers engaged with him online, which is a classic counterterrorism methodology, if you will. There are no secrets with that here. Engaged with him and put together an excellent operation. And even though Al-Faisal never set foot when he was committing the crime on the ground in New York State or New York City in particular, it was enough to prosecute him. He was extradited from Jamaica to face state charges, and he already was sentenced to 18 years in jail. So again, this underscores the point that I said at the outset, that the Intelligence Bureau of NYPD is extremely aggressive in their work. And I was particularly heartened by the details of this case, as I understand it. So that's the Al-Faisal case that you can look up. And finally, I always want to talk about hostages and hostage-related cases and wrongful detentions. So a Wall Street Journal article, I was grateful to see it published, talked about a new private commission that's been put together. In full disclosure, I'm part of that commission. I'm just another voice to look at wrongful detentions. But we're joined by Ambassador Robert O'Brien, Ambassador Roger Carstens, and we're trying to figure out what are the action items. How can the U.S. government focus on this problem? How can we also energize foreign actors and foreign governments to be very much focused on this particular threat. More to follow on that. Obviously, I can't share what we discuss privately, but I'm excited about being a part of this. And I think we have a world-class group of people that are focused on it. It's sponsored by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And last point, my book recommendation has absolutely nothing to do with anything I've talked about today, but I absolutely enjoyed a book published by Oxford University Press. It's called Spying on the Reich. And one of the key themes is it is really hard to predict behavior of one individual. In this case, it was Adolf Hitler leading up to the Second World War. You can make an analogy similar with how we predict Russian behavior when Putin is the sole decision maker. But I think it's an excellent historical study of what foreign powers knew about Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime leading up to the Second World War. Love to read about MI6 and the Secret Intelligence Service and MI5, their work in the fledgling U.S. intelligence services during that time period. So I highly recommend it. The book's published by an individual by the name of Howard. So I covered a lot of ground. I'll kick it over to Rebecca. I don't think she is going to offer a lot of remarks, and we'll probably dive into questions and answers, but I'm so grateful to have Rebecca here today. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm so delighted to be here. And, I will say that over the last couple of months, as we've been talking through this and talking through issues that are so front of mind to all of us, I've just been reminded how lucky I am that you are such an extraordinary leader, intelligence officer, military officer, and also mentor to next generation leaders. So I just wanted to thank you deeply for all of the insights that you've provided. And hopefully we can provide more to all of our audience members. Now, you've laid the table very well on a wide range of issues that we are confronting. And many of these issues you may not think of as being front of mind for local law enforcement like the NYPD. In point of fact, our program is wide-ranging. Our jurisdiction is broad, and the breadth and depth of the issues that we're navigating at the moment is pretty expansive. So what I'll do for just a couple minutes, just so we can level set, is give you a sense for any audience members who aren't familiar with NYPD's counterterrorism and intelligence program of how it is structured and what we do, and a little bit on the current threat environment, which picks up on a lot of the articles that Chris just flagged. So as he mentioned, post 9/11, the commissioner at the time, the mayor at the time, decided that NYPD needed to develop its own independent counterterrorism capability that would work alongside, hand in glove with federal government, but have some native capabilities and resources that were going to be focused on counterterrorism. Today, this is housed under one bureau, the Bureau of Intelligence and Counterterrorism. And we do 4 core missions that operate on a continuum from deterrence through disruption, detection and disruption, to defense. And put most simply, we collect information from the public, from the human intelligence sources that Chris mentioned in reference to one of our investigations, from partners. And we think about partnership very broadly. Partners include state, local, international law enforcement and intelligence agencies, federal obviously as well. They include private sector, they include members of the public. Our hope is to have as much information that we can possibly consume into our apparatus so that we can analyze it and turn it into intelligence. So the second core mission is on the analysis side. All of the information is processed by teams of analysts who I used to oversee in my earlier years, who are turning information into intelligence that we then operationalize. And this is consistent with how many federal agencies approach the domain of intelligence and law enforcement. It's an unusually large footprint for local law enforcement to have. NYPD's program is large, and it is international. not just in purpose and in purview, but actually in physical footprint. So we operationalize the intelligence by deploying physical assets around the city based on threats that we're seeing and trends that we're observing. And these are often officers who are armed with heavy weapons and have specialized training, and they're deployed to what we call do target hardening. They can also do emergency response capabilities when needed. And this includes all of the range of typical day-to-day threats that police departments deal with, as well as some atypical ones. So think about chemical, biological, nuclear weapons detection and mitigation strategies and specialized elements in our bomb squad. We have officers who are part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force who are under our umbrella doing the detect and disrupt investigative piece. And then we share, and that's where our international program really comes into play. And the NYPD's philosophy is that all of this information and all of this expertise that we've developed over the last 20 years is helpful only if it can help our partners as well. So we share as much information and as much intelligence as we can with as broad a range of partners as we can. The international program is unique for local law enforcement. It was, again, emerges out of the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And we currently have 14 cities around the globe where there is an NYPD detective or sergeant who is stationed there, acting as an ambassador for the department and for the city, doing what we call asking the New York question when an incident occurs or a trend materializes that would potentially have an impact back in New York. What would the ISIS attacks in France in 2015 look like in New York? How can we take lessons learned and apply them to continuing to fortify our city and make it stronger and protect it better? An officer who was posted in Australia deployed immediately when Brenton Tarrant attacked 2 mosques in New Zealand back in 2019 to help ensure that we could provide whatever help and support we could from the NYPD to officers who are in the midst of dealing with crisis, also to give us a sense of how we should in real time deploy the resources I was talking about earlier to protect houses of worship here in New York. So again, we have a very expansive notion of our own jurisdiction, and that's born out of being a center of gravity for terrorism activity across the ideological spectrum well before 9/11 and subsequent to it. So the threat, and Chris has picked up on a lot of buckets of threat that we're currently contending with, has changed a lot over the last 20 years, certainly since I joined the department in 2006. And we were really focused on external threat actors like Al-Qaeda and other foreign terrorist organizations. And around 2010, that began to change, and the shift from external to what we call homegrown violent extremists started manifesting in our city. And this was driven by a lot of different things. Technology was a part of it, and social media in particular. And of course, the shift from external to homegrown actors intensified greatly when ISIS declared its caliphate. And we saw a sizable increase in the amount of terrorism activity in the city in the 2013 to really 16 timeframe. And since then, the big trend has been diversification, ideological diversification. So still dealing with the typical threat actors, the Al-Qaedas, the ISIS, and those who are inspired, particularly in the homegrown violent extremist camp, but also now dealing with accelerationist and white supremacist activity, violent anarchist activity, the political clashes that accompany far right, far left around polarizing issues that have cultural significance in this country. The transnational threat arena is one where we've seen a real uptick in energy and activity. And Chris mentioned Chinese police stations and transnational repression. We also see this playing out from Iran and focusing on targeting of dissidents, including within New York City. So if we think back around a year, we can tick off a couple of different cases that were either attacks in the larger New York area or thwarted attacks. And it gives you just a sense of the range of issues and ideologies that we're dealing with. And then I'll focus on a couple drivers that I think are important, and we'll open it up for some back and forth with Chris and I and questions later. But if we go back to last spring, you had an incident on this New York City subway. And if any of you are in New York, you will certainly remember, maybe others of you were tracking this as well. An individual named Frank James opened up and shot 10 people on the New York City subway. Obviously, a huge vulnerable touch point for anyone who takes the New York City subway, large system, a lot of volume of people, mass shooting. And he had been animated in part by consuming large volumes of race-based conspiracy theories. And this will lead nicely into a conversation down the road about the impact of disinformation and conspiracy and how that's being turbocharged by generative AI. But we see that resulting in violence on the streets of New York City last year. A few weeks later, of course, you had up in Buffalo, Peyton Gendron, in a horrific neo-Nazi accelerationist or hallmark accelerationist attack against a grocery store, the Tops grocery store. Over the summer, 2 incidents that fall into the transnational threat bucket in a couple of weeks apart. You had a dissident, Iranian dissident in Brooklyn, who was threatened with an attempted assassination in front of her residence. And there you have the footprints of some Iranian involvement. And then a few weeks later, Salman Rushdie was attacked up in Chautauqua by an individual who seems to have some degree of inspiration for a form of jihadism that we typically deal with, Sunni jihadism, and here we have Shia jihadism. You had 2 thwarted attacks against New York City synagogues, and Chris started off by talking about the rise of anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitism has been really normalized, unfortunately, across the country in the last couple of years. So 2 targeted incidents against synagogues, luckily both thwarted, from individuals who crossed the ideological spectrum. So one who was more in the jihadist camp, another group of individuals who were arrested in Penn Station with Nazi armbands and paraphernalia and a firearm, who were coming from the neo-Nazi side of the equation. And again, we had an incident back in New Year's Eve in Times Square, an individual who seems to be self-radicalized from Maine, who traveled down into New York and sought to attack a couple of our NYPD officers, and the closing of a Chinese police station a few weeks ago and the arrest of a couple individuals associated with that. So what you see in this laundry list of incidents, and there's obviously a lot more, is that we've got a robust pace of activity and a wide array of drivers. And this is true for many reasons. It is driven in some degree by technology. It is also, I think, an important, I am assuming that those of you who are listening will say to yourself, maybe I was tracking 1 or 2 of these incidents, but probably not all of them. And I think that's a good reminder that terrorism is no longer the front page news that it has been and it was in the 9/11 until a couple of years ago timeframe. There have been a lot of diversion of resources away from CT toward great power conflict, Russia's war in Ukraine. The China issue is certainly in that bucket, and Iran. And for us, local law enforcement, we've been contending with for the last 3 years pretty sharp increases in criminal activity around our city and across cities across the country. So there's been, I think, a preoccupation with other areas and other priorities. That said, the CT threat lives on, and we at the NYPD are doing everything that we can to make sure that we are remembering the reason that we are all here today and that our bureau was created, which is just steps from the window that's right behind me and the aftermath of all of that. So I will stop there and we can open it up to questions.
Rebecca, thank you for all that clarity. I know Amanda's going to jump on the questions in a second. Again, I want to thank you for all the detail and the work that you do. And it was not unnoticed that you offered some kind remarks at the outset. Thank you in the same for the work that you do for New York City, but more broadly, the influence that you're having across the field. So thank you very much for that. We're really grateful. So Amanda, I know we have questions already teed up. I do want to encourage our audience to send in your questions because this is a rare opportunity to have somebody from the Intelligence Bureau at Spy Chat. So over to you, Amanda.
Oh, here they come. I see them coming fast and furious. But first of all, we're wondering if you both could share your perspective on the role that the intelligence community, law enforcement, and government should play in the information environment as it relates to disinformation and weaponized information. Just a little question.
Go ahead, Rebecca, you can kick it off.
Yes, so this is a topic of great interest, of course, to everybody, and including to the NYPD. And we've just seen a pretty dramatic increase in a couple things that emanate from the disinformation space. And one of those is the younger and younger age of many of our would-be assailants, our subjects of investigation, and individuals who are not just radicalizing online, which we have certainly seen over the last 15 years, but mobilizing toward violence. And I shouldn't say that disinformation fueled violence is the domain of youth. It isn't exclusively. The individual I mentioned earlier, Frank James, was on the older end of the spectrum, but it's a troubling, I'd say, overlap of trends that we've observed. My concern, and we've talked a lot about this, Chris, in the last few months, and I know that I've talked to many others as well, is how new emerging technologies, and in particular, generative AI, fuels the production and dissemination of disinformation in a way that is profoundly destabilizing. And we've started to see here in New York a little bit of that coming into fruition. And so for any of you who are not familiar, generative AI programs allow for the creation of content, whether that's content in prose or video and image content, that you can ask a prompt and get something immediately in response. And Chris mentioned an interesting image that was posted on a blue check verified Twitter account 2 weeks ago that managed to make the S&P swoon and lose $300 billion in value momentarily before it was identified as being fake and removed. And this image purported to show an explosion right outside of the Pentagon. There are videos that are entirely created through AI generation. And we ourselves, so part of our goal here at the NYPD is to make sure that we're staying ahead of threats as they're coming toward us. So we've been trying to look around online for disinformation fueled by AI. Of course, there's plenty of disinformation that isn't, and also seeing how easy it is to create some. And what we've learned is that what the technology allows one to do, whether one is a nefarious actor with intent to do harm or merely joking around, and you can go and you can find entire channels that are dedicated to AI-generated imagery, is to just really turbocharge something that's been growing and growing over the last several years, which is production of inauthentic material. And somebody used the phrase inauthenticity at scale is the real risk posed by generative AI. I mean, of course, scientists are now talking about mass extinction risks and all sorts of, really concerning thoughts and statements. But what we've seen materialize is just a huge uptick in volume of disinformation. And, law enforcement is forced to respond to emergencies. Obviously, that's our core mission. When a chatbot calls 911 and says that a bomb has been placed in a local school and can answer in a pretty credible way the questions that the 911 operator is asking, we will then have to make some form of response. If there is a combination of texts and images that suggest an emergency is happening in not just our immediate AOR, but more distant, we will expend resources to chase it down. And I think a lot of departments don't have the benefit of 50,000 men and women and a lot of ability to vet information quickly before responding to it. So there's a diversion of resources element to this problem. when you're talking about disinformation that local law enforcement is receiving. But I think the more concerning issue is how the individual user is going to consume and then potentially act on information that they think is true, and it's going to be almost impossible for them to verify. So we see images of freight train derailments that are accompanied by a toxic plume of smoke, or individuals, officers who are beating children. You know, you can imagine a set of provocative fake information that would inspire people potentially to take action. So I think there is going to be a real public safety overlay to the application of emerging technologies that already has existed in recent years, but not with the intensity that we expect to see it going forward.
Well, I don't have a lot to add on artificial intelligence because Rebecca is an expert on it, and I really appreciate the detailed response to a great question. I want to go back to classic disinformation, so we don't ignore that either. Not that we're ignoring anything on Spy Chat, but at the same time, we sometimes forget the origins of disinformation, going back to a very, very young Soviet Union that practiced disinformation on a scale that was hard to comprehend in the West. So the Soviet Union and the successor states, Russia, are very adept at taking something that has some believability and turn that into active disinformation. And they did that almost like an art form throughout the Cold War. And we see a continuation of disinformation today. And remember, because societies across the globe, not just here in the United States, are already hardwired to believe what they want to believe in their own social ecosystems, if you will, and the fact that across the globe, people are polarized and there's an anti-government bent. Again, this is a trend globally that the Director of National Intelligence in their global trends talked about these kinds of things. So all of that said, it just demonstrates that there are significant vulnerabilities because there's a predisposition for people to go to their own sources of information, and those sources of information will be victimized by intelligence services. And that was the traditional threat. But now we have a far more essentially there's a greater equality, if you will. That's the word I'm looking for. There's more people have tools that states used to use that used to be dominated by intelligence services, for example. Now those tools are being used again by smaller groups that have an issue that they want to propagate, that they want to focus on, and they want to not only practice deception, but actively use disinformation to further their goals. So these are the challenges now. And the government is not going to be able to police the internet, nor does the FBI want to do that. And just one other data point that I want to point out, not too long ago, the Department of Homeland Security weighed in and tried to put together a board, an organization that was going to get at the heart of disinformation, purely because the U.S. intelligence community understands that disinformation is a national security problem. But when they tried, DHS, to wade into this problem, they caught, flack from the left and from the right. You're policing up speech. This is 1984, George Orwell, and that program was curtailed or certainly put on ice. So it just demonstrates the fraught period that we are in because of social media now being employed. That in the old days, disinformation was seed of deceptive material dropped into a press article in India, for example, that gets picked up globally over time. It was glacial, but eventually that disinformation picked up. Now it's instantaneous. So those are the challenges we're dealing with. So I just wanted to kind of provide a little context from a historical standpoint.
So we got a question that related to your mentioning this failed rollout of the DHS Disinformation Governance Board. This doesn't impact you, Chris, because you are director of a museum, and we are not affiliated with any organization. But Rebecca, does this sort of politicization of disinformation, has it changed your work focus or how you can speak about what you're doing or how you choose to speak publicly about what you're doing in any way?
And that's a good question. I think one of the animating philosophies of NYPD's approach to countering terrorism is that we develop independent capabilities and we coordinate early and often extensively with federal counterparts. And so, it's been really important to us over the years to make sure that we're understanding threats with as much nuance as we possibly can, and that our focus is on the public safety of our city. And so whatever we see as an emerging issue, we will delve into and we will figure out how best to address it. And of course, we have to do that with our partners. We rely heavily on our federal partners, and we have wonderful relationships with them. But it's allowed us to look really hard at threats when it's been maybe a little bit difficult in other places of the government. And that's true. We put together a team of investigators and analysts and partners focusing on what we call racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism about 5 years ago. And that was in part in response to incidents overseas. I flagged threatened terrorist attack in Christchurch. This was before Peyton Gendron's attack in Buffalo, obviously several years. But we were seeing an uptick in the white supremacist neo-Nazi threat and said, we really need to focus resources on this. And so, we are apolitical in a way that I think, the intel community has always prided itself on being apolitical. And that's a hallmark of our law enforcement and intel apparatus nationwide. But NYPD has the ability to focus our own resources on understanding these threats. And that's been true in the disinformation space as well, as we've started to see people taking action. And sometimes the action isn't terroristic, it's just criminal action. But when the investigators debrief the individual under arrest, they say something surprising about a conspiracy theory that might have focused their action in a particular direction. And then we'll unravel that and say, what is it about this conspiracy theory and what are you consuming and who else is consuming it alongside you and really should we be worried? And this is all, of course, we've got legal architecture that govern our activities. We have a unique legal architecture that is modeled on but separate from the U.S. Attorney General guidelines called the Handshoe Consent Decree. And I won't bore everybody on the podcast with our legal constraints, but we're very well attuned to the First Amendment protections that are afforded to people in their online behavior. We're attuned to the laws of the state of New York that we have to follow, as well as, beyond constitutional statutory laws across the country. And that said, our responsibility and our remit is public safety. So the disinformation space is really, it's concerning. It's also quite complex. And I think a local law enforcement agency doesn't have some of the tools at our fingertips to be able to attribute the actor of a particular series of tweets or an information campaign, right? That's a little beyond our capabilities. So we're left sorting through the tools, trying to identify and measure the resonance and impact, and relying on federal support to give us a sense of, oh, well, this came out of Russia and this came out of China, or this came out of somebody's computer in Bay Ridge.
I'm going to ask one more disinformation question, and then we'll step away to a few other topics. But Chris, you have a fan who read your article with Josh Geltzer in 2019 on disinformation, and the guest wants to know if the global pandemic, if the ensuing years have changed anything about your thoughts about the IC's role with disinformation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate that someone actually read an article I wrote, so that's great news. Yeah, I think that what's happening in Europe right now as it relates to the war in Ukraine underscores this idea of the intelligence community calling out disinformation. So all throughout the pandemic, I think there were concerns about racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists and people radicalizing. All of that was playing out, and that was what I was zeroed in on as I reflected on this idea of disinformation in terms of electoral interference. Then all of a sudden you have a war in Ukraine coming out of the pandemic. Obviously not related to the pandemic, but what you've seen happen is intelligence services, the United States intelligence community in particular, actually it's a policy decision, but the intelligence has called out the fact that, hey, this is an active disinformation campaign, or the Russians are doing this, and this is preemptive. So if these things happen, then it's a Russian operation. It's not a Ukrainian military operation. In other words, the government is calling out disinformation. I went back and looked at my article, anticipating it might come up today, and I was reminded that one of our principal recommendations to the U.S. government, as people, of course, Josh is back in the government now, I'm on the outside, was the idea that the U.S. government has to do more to call out disinformation. At the risk, there is a risk of sources and methods. But with all that factored in, the U.S. government has to call out disinformation. So what I've seen happen as it plays out in Ukraine is DNI has made decisions, again, policy decisions, but specific decisions on what intelligence to call out, to capture that publicly, and for the media to pick up on it. I think that is really important. So one of our main recommendations that Josh and I had is really playing out as a result of the war in Ukraine. Because again, back to the history of Russia, and the Soviet Union before the Russian Federation, this idea of disinformation is, part of one of the arrows in the quiver of Russia. So it's called out. So I appreciate the question.
I add one just quick thing, and I think it's really important because, as a consumer of the government's strategy of we're going to declassify information, we're going to call out disinformation, we're going to open up a little bit of the black box of our decision-making apparatus, which I think was very brave and extremely successful on the federal government's side. And one of the issues that I think wraps a lot of these different threats we're dealing with, whether we're at the NYPD or in the intel community or the White House or just in our own private lives, is that we have widespread distrust with dissatisfaction around our institutions. And that, I think, was quite fueled by the pandemic in the last 3 years. But nonetheless, it has a long tail. And to the degree that people have lost faith in their institutions, having more information that is verified at their fingertips to help inform their choices is really helpful and needed. So somehow we all have to collectively solve our crisis of faith in institutions and in governance. And one of the ways we do that is by giving people a very clear sense of what they can rely on and what's true and what's not. And disinformation becomes so crippling because it compounds some of the sense we have of we can't really believe anything in the news anymore.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Thanks for pointing that out, Rebecca. And just the other idea that, again, the idea of apocalypticism, the idea of accelerationism, meaning, that the white race is being threatened. All of these ideas are perpetuated by, in part, misinformation, in some cases by active disinformation, but there's some seed of truth in the fact that governments were incapable of taking care of some of their population during the pandemic. So seeds of truth then exploited by, again, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists and an anti-government bent. So that's a really, really important point. And there are an increase, because of global warming, an increase in natural disasters, forest fires, and the resultant smoke that comes from forest fires. In these natural disasters also feed disinformation, misinformation, and anger the general public. And this, again, was called out by the Director of National Intelligence in one of their global trends reports. It's not going away. So really important points. Thanks for that, Rebecca.
Switching towards a little more international, not that this hasn't been international, but someone has a very specific question about the NYPD's positioning of personnel internationally or overseas. Is that something you're able to talk about, still doing effectively? How is that going?
Yes, so no, it's a great question. And we still do have this international liaison program that Chris and I mentioned earlier. We currently have 14 international posts, and it's been very effective. It's been effective certainly at helping us respond and provide support for incidents that are occurring around the world. If there is support that we can provide, it's certainly helped us strengthen the protection in our own city by understanding individual incidents, but also threat streams and also trends. It's also been useful in the criminal context. There was an interesting example we had a couple of years ago where a man unfortunately murdered his 1-year-old baby and then fled. And it was through the collaborative effort of 2 of our international liaison posts that we were able to intercept him as he arrived at the airport in Bangkok and serve him with an arrest warrant that was helped by our Interpol liaison. And so he got a notice when he arrived at the airport and didn't actually transit into Thai space, and was met with an NYPD detective, which he was obviously very surprised to see within 15 hours or so of his departure from his midway stop, that he had already been arrested and was brought to justice here in New York. And the whole thing lasted about 36 hours from when we unfortunately came across or dead child. So this program can reap dividends beyond just the terrorism context in the conventional crime arena. And we also, as I mentioned, we rely very heavily on our partners. So these officers are usually embedded within local law enforcement agencies and sometimes federal. They are working hand in glove with federal counterparts there. They don't have the same kind of authorities to operate overseas, so they're not doing investigative work in the same way that members of federal agencies who are stationed abroad do. And that allows them to develop relationships that can help complement our federal government's efforts internationally as well. So it's great for relationship building, it's great for understanding threats, and it's great for solving crimes.
I find the next question incredibly meaningful and useful. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say myself. This individual lives and works near the Tree of Life, where the Tree of Life shooting occurred. The first part of the trial has begun, and unfortunately, the person and their neighbors and coworkers have begun to notice an uptick in anti-Semitic stickers, propaganda popping up. What advice do you have for civilians, citizens reporting on such, not wanting this to be a crackdown on free speech, but how uncomfortable and how awful it is to see? I see this sometimes in my neighborhood too. So I want to hear what you have to say. What can we do?
That is a great question. And first of all, super unfortunate that you're observing this activity. Also super important that you do report it. because that's how we can understand and respond to a trend. So one day's stickering and flyering, which is First Amendment protected, could be another day's actual crime. And that's not to say that there is a necessary slippery slope between the First Amendment protected activity and the criminal activity at all. But we need to be able to take a measure of what's happening. And we spend a lot of time thinking about trajectory, and are we seeing an increase in a particular kind of activity, or a decrease, or a level setting? And I mentioned a normalization of anti-Semitic behavior and activity and just rhetoric online over the last couple of years. So it's quite important that you report that. You can document it, and you can reach out to local law enforcement. And that's the sort of thing, even though it's in Pittsburgh, we at the NYPD would like to take note. And that doesn't mean that we would be able to arrest and look for hate crime charges against, although in some cases that might be warranted. The individual perpetrators, maybe that would be actually something that would make sense given the facts. That's what we would take a look at. But your local law enforcement will too, and so would the FBI. And I think a trial that is so significant and representative of such a terrible incident, but beyond the terrible incident, representative of a really concerning trend, is absolutely the purview of law enforcement, and never hesitate to reach out and tell us things when you see them.
Thanks, Rebecca. I just want to also add, Anti-Defamation League is a great resource for our audience. We've engaged with the ADL for advice how to handle situations, and I truly know that that Rebecca has had some influence. I somehow think that perhaps whether she owns up to it or not, she may have had influence on the White House's policy, because they frequently reach out to people that have worked in this space for some time. So I think that's a great question, but the idea of going to ADL and seeing their resources is also equally important, but it's a troubling trend.
We don't have much time, but I do want to try to, and I'm not going to get to everybody's question, but I'd like to squeeze in this final one, which is, has there been evidence of financial support from Russia or China or other foreign countries for U.S. domestic terrorism or radical racist groups here?
I think what I will say is that we do see a pretty strong transnational footprint to some of, not all, but some of the racially and ethnically motivated extremist activity that's manifesting here. And, it really underlines that what we thought of as international terrorism for many years is quite domestic now. And what we thought of as domestic terrorism is also international. So the boundarylessness of the threats that we're contending with is an important trend among them. And so whether it is a particular nation state like Russia, and there are examples of a nexus between Russian-based actors and groups and US-based actors and groups in the REMB space, are other countries, and this of course leads back to our conversation around disinformation as well, you do see common cause, and it could be something less geopolitically significant and more similar to two 15 or 16-year-olds in different continents that are meeting each other online and radicalizing one another by consuming and sharing not just propaganda, but targeting and tactical guidance. So the transnational links that we see operate on many different planes, and they're an important driver of the threat.
I would just add, there was an excellent story that hit the media that underscores I think the intent of that question. And the press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Middle District of Florida was the following: U.S. citizens and Russian intelligence officers charged with conspiring to use U.S. citizens as illegal agents of the Russian government. So this continues to be a problem. And again, the origins go back to, as I said, Russia's intelligence services, but the defendants sought to sow discord, spread pro-Russian propaganda. I don't know how much money was involved with this, but clearly there was tie-in. to the Russian government. So that's just one example. Now you factor in China and Iranian meddling. It's a problem.
Well, this is not my most uplifting spy chat, but it has perhaps been one of the most informative. I thank you both for this deep dive, and I feel like I have learned so much. Any final comments before I wrap it up, Chris or Rebecca?
Just to say thank you to everyone for listening. And, you know, we are all in this together, and the space is changing a lot. And we so appreciate everybody's interest, and also your information early and often. Let us know how we can help you, and we will try our best at the NYPD.
Rebecca, I knew this would be one of my favorite spy chats. I really enjoyed this, and I think our guests gained so much knowledge from listening to you. So thank you so much to you and to our team and to Zach and his team. Very grateful.
Yes, we really, and when I say it wasn't the most uplifting, I really learned a lot, but it's just so much to wrestle with. I want to thank Zach Schwitzky and Limbic once again for supporting the program so we can bring this sort of high-level conversation to the public for free. So thank you, Limbic. Our next program, very different. If you are in the DC area, it is live at noon tomorrow at the Spy Museum, also free. And it's about Noor Khan, a really inspirational World War II spy who, against the odds, really got the information to the Allies from occupied France. So if you are in the neighborhood, stop by. We would love to see you in person. And if you'd like to sign up for that or other programs, please look at our online calendar. And everyone, be alert, take note, let Rebecca know anything you find out. And we thank you for being with us so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.